In 2019, researchers at the University of Chicago asked a group of financial advisors to complete a standard risk tolerance questionnaire, the same kind of questionnaire they administer to their own clients to determine appropriate investment allocations. The advisors had, on average, 15 years of experience. They administered these questionnaires routinely. The researchers found that the risk tolerance scores the advisors reported for themselves varied significantly, depending on whether the advisors completed the questionnaire during a period of market stability or during a period of market volatility. The same people, asked the same questions, reported meaningfully different risk tolerances depending on market conditions that had no effect on their actual financial situation, on their savings, their income, their time horizon, or their actual capacity to absorb loss. The risk tolerance the advisors believed they had, and the risk tolerance their questionnaire responses implied they had, was state-dependent. It changed based on current market conditions rather than representing a stable underlying characteristic of their financial situation. This is not a finding about unsophisticated investors making emotional decisions. It is a finding about experienced financial professionals who had spent 15 years helping clients understand their own risk tolerances and who still could not reliably report their own. The risk tolerance problem nobody wants to diagnose is not that individuals and organizations misjudge their risk tolerance in obvious ways. The problem is more specific and more pervasive. The risk tolerance that feels accurate in stable conditions is systematically higher than the risk tolerance that actually governs behavior when conditions are not stable. And this gap between stated risk tolerance and revealed risk tolerance is almost never examined honestly before the conditions that would reveal it arrive. Organizations have the same problem, expressed differently. A company sets a strategic risk tolerance in good conditions. It is willing to accept a certain level of volatility in exchange for the opportunity for above-average returns. This tolerance is stated in strategy documents, presented to boards, communicated to investors. It is, at the time it is stated, genuinely believed by the people stating it. When the volatility the strategy was supposed to produce arrives, when the quarterly results are disappointing, when the market moves against the strategic bet, when the press coverage turns negative, the organization's revealed risk tolerance turns out to be lower than its stated risk tolerance. The strategy that was supposed to accept volatility to achieve returns is revised, the risk exposure is reduced, and the strategic objective is quietly lowered to match the level of risk the organization is actually willing to maintain. This is not dishonesty. It is a structural feature of how risk tolerance works. Stated risk tolerance is assessed in conditions of low stress, and those conditions make the discomfort of high stress underestimating. The gap between stated and revealed risk tolerance is not a character failure. It is a measurement problem. The specific organizational behavior this produces is easy to recognize in retrospect and very hard to recognize in real time. The board-approved 3-year strategic plan that becomes a 1-year plan after the first bad quarter. The investment in a new market that gets redescribed as a pilot after 12 months of below-expectation results. The talent acquisition strategy that gets revised from hire aggressively to hire selectively after a compensation survey reveals what the competitive market looks like. Each of these revisions is, individually, a reasonable response to new information. The pattern they form, a strategy that consistently contracts under the pressure of the first deviation from expectation, is the revealed risk tolerance of the organization, and it is almost always lower than the stated risk tolerance that the strategy was built around. Have you ever watched an organization discover under pressure that its actual risk tolerance was significantly lower than the risk tolerance its strategy had assumed? Leave a comment. The organizational risk tolerance problem has a specific consequence that compounds the gap between stated and revealed. The strategy that is designed for the stated risk tolerance will, when it encounters conditions that reveal the lower actual risk tolerance, produce a cycle of strategic revision that is itself more damaging than the original risk would have been. Consider, a company decides to invest in building a new product category. The investment requires 12 to 18 months of negative cash flow before the category generates returns. The stated risk tolerance includes 18 months of negative cash flow. The board approved the plan. The investors were informed. The team was hired. At month 8, the cash flow is negative as planned. The category is not yet generating returns as expected, but the conditions at month 8 feel different from the conditions in which the plan was approved. At approval, the negative cash flow was theoretical. At month 8, it is actual, and it is visible to the same people who approved it when it was theoretical. Their revealed risk tolerance turns out to be lower than the tolerance they expressed when approving a negative cash flow they had not yet experienced. The response? The investment is cut. The team is reduced. The timeline is compressed. The product that needed 18 months gets 8. The product that 8 months produces is worse than the product 18 months would have produced, which confirms the decision-maker's emerging belief that the investment was the wrong call, which leads to the investment being cut further, which produces a product that is worse still, which confirms the decision to cut. This cycle, stated tolerance enabling investment, revealed tolerance triggering contraction, contraction producing a worse outcome than full commitment would have, is one of the most common and most unexamined mechanisms in organizational strategy failure. It produces outcomes that are worse than either committing fully or not starting, because it combines the cost of the investment with the cost of insufficient commitment to make the investment productive. If the specific mechanics of this cycle, how the gap between stated and revealed risk tolerance compounds into strategic failure, is the level of analysis you come for, the like is the direct signal. The most consequential version of the organizational risk tolerance problem occurs in situations where the gap between stated and revealed tolerance is not visible to the people who approve the strategy. The board that approved an 18-month negative cash flow investment typically contains people who have individual risk tolerances that vary significantly. The stated risk tolerance, 18 months of negative cash flow, is an aggregated position that may not accurately represent what any individual board member will actually be willing to maintain when month 8 arrives with actual losses rather than projected ones. The board member who was the most supportive of the investment in the approval meeting may be the board member who raises the most urgent concerns at month 8, not because their underlying financial analysis has changed, but because the experience of an actual loss feels different from the analysis of a projected loss, and the gap between those two feelings, repeated across board members, produces a collective revealed risk tolerance that is lower than the collective stated risk tolerance that approved the investment. The company that could address this problem most directly would, before approving any investment with a planned period of negative outcomes, simulate the experience of those negative outcomes, not theoretically, but viscerally, with specific numbers and specific scenarios, and ask each stakeholder to commit to their behavior under those conditions before the conditions arrive. This almost never happens. Projections of future losses are presented in spreadsheets, which create an intellectual experience of loss rather than an emotional one. The emotional experience arrives when the projections become actuals, by which point the conditions for honest recalibration of risk tolerance have been replaced by the social and political conditions of managing an investment that is not performing to plan. The practical response to the risk tolerance problem is not to set lower strategic risk tolerances. that produces strategies that are too conservative for the opportunities they're supposed to address. It is to do two specific things that most organizations skip. The first, before committing to any strategy with a planned period of negative outcomes, explicitly identify the specific conditions, not the average case, but the worst case within the plan's range, under which you would revise the strategy. Write those conditions down. Commit to not revising the strategy unless those conditions are met. This converts the stated risk tolerance from a general disposition into a specific, bounded commitment that is harder to erode through the emotional experience of actual loss. The second, before approving the strategy, have the people who will be most responsible for maintaining it, the board, the executive team, the investors, explicitly state what the decision rule will be at the first planned negative outcome, not "we'll assess the situation," a specific rule. If the rule cannot be agreed upon before the investment is made, the disagreement about the rule is evidence that the stated risk tolerance does not represent a genuine consensus, and the strategy should not proceed until the disagreement is resolved. Neither of these is comfortable to execute. They require people to commit to future behavior under conditions that feel theoretical at the time of commitment. But that discomfort is precisely the work that the risk tolerance problem requires, because the discomfort of committing in advance is far less than the cost of discovering the actual risk tolerance only after the investment has been made and the conditions have arrived. The next episode looks at the experts who consistently underestimate uncertainty and at the research on why expertise makes this worse rather than better. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.